All right, for this next part, what we want to do is we want to see uh, what happens to the graph in vertex form. So we've seen what happens to the graphs when we're not in vertex form, but now we want to look at what happens to the graphs when we're in vertex form. So we're going to use Desmos graphing technology. We're going to graph x squared, and then we want to see what happens when we add and subtract things inside the parentheses and see what happens. So I went to Desmos. Here's Desmos, and this red graph is x squared. Okay, we can see that the red graph there is x squared. What we want to do is we want to figure out what happens when I add or subtract things inside the parentheses. So I'm going to switch over to the blue graph, and we'll start by subtracting things. If I subtract 6, look what it did to the graph. It took my x squared graph in red here, and it moved it 6 units to the right. Well, what if I subtract 4? It takes my red graph of x squared and it moves it to the right 4 units. What if I subtract 2? You guessed it, it takes that red graph and it moves it to the right 2. Okay, so what it looks like when I subtract things inside the parenthesis, it moves the graph to the right that many units. What do you think is going to happen if I add? And if you guessed that it would move it to the left, if I add 6, notice it moves my graph to the left 6 units. This is happening because when I add or subtract inside these parentheses here, what I'm doing is I'm trying to find what x value is making this entire parenthesis equal to 0. If I put an x value of -6 in here, -6 plus 6 will make that parenthesis equal to 0. That's why it moves over to -6. If I add 4, it should move over to -4, and it did. If I add 2, it should move to the left 2 units, which would put me at -2. So adding inside the parentheses moves my graph to the left. Subtracting inside the parentheses moves my graph to the right. And we can say that, I'm going to replay this. I had already written this out. Adding values inside the parentheses causes the graph to shift left and right. For adding, the graph will shift to the left. For subtracting, the graph will shift to the right. And again, this left and right shift happens because we are looking for what value makes inside that parenthesis equal to 0. Okay, so that's shifting things to the left and the right. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to graph this function, y equals x minus 1, the quantity squared, and we're going to experiment with adding and subtracting things on the outside of the parentheses. So I have this graph saved in here. So let's open up this graph. I believe this is the one. It is. Now, this red graph, the x minus 1, I'm subtracting inside the parentheses, so it moves to the right. So I'm starting over here at +1. Now, what happens with the blue graph if I add 1? Notice it shifts it upward. What if I add 3? Notice it shifts it up 3 units. What if I add 6? Notice it moved it up 6 units. So this -1 inside the parenthesis is shifting it to the right 1, and then adding 6 is making it go up 6. So look at my vertex. My vertex is the point 1, 6. And I can kind of see that in my function. What happens if I subtract numbers? What if I subtract 1? Notice it shifted down 1 unit. What if I subtract 4? Notice it shifted down 4 units. What if I subtract, 7? Notice it shifted it down 7. So this outside the parenthesis, adding values outside the parenthesis, subtracting values outside the parenthesis, causes my graph to shift up and down. Okay, so we can come over here and we can replay this, and it will tell us. For adding outside the parentheses, we're going to shift the graph up. For subtracting values outside the parentheses, we're going to shift the graph down. Okay? Now, we also want to see what happens when we multiply by different values. So if I go to this blue graph, what if I multiply in front of the parentheses by 3? Look what happened. It made it skinnier, just like in the standard function, right? The standard form. When we multiplied by numbers, it made the graph skinnier because it's growing faster. What if I multiply by 5? It's even skinnier. Okay? What if I multiply by a fraction, 0.5? I'm hoping it makes it wider than the original, and it did. Notice, because it's growing half as fast. Now what happens if I put a negative on the outside? What do you think is going to happen? Well, I would expect it to turn upside down. And there it is. If I put a negative on the outside of the parenthesis, it opens upside down. If I put a negative 4 outside the parenthesis, it opens upside down because it's negative, and it's really skinny because it's growing 4 times as fast. Okay? So all that same stuff that happened with standard form happens in vertex form. So if we want to put this in a nutshell, multiplying outside the parentheses has the same effect as it did in standard form. If we multiply by a negative, it's going to cause my graph to open downward. Okay, so all of that same stuff happens when I multiply outside the parenthesis. Okay, now for these, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of all this because I want to go through this with you. Okay, we want to find, for each of these functions, we want to find the coordinates of the vertex, and we also want to be able to determine, does the graph open up or down? Okay, so here's my first equation. The x plus 10, the quantity squared. Well, what x value makes inside the parenthesis 0? Well, that would be a negative 10, so that's the x value of my vertex. What value is added on the outside? Well, there's nothing. We could put a plus 0. So the 0 is the y value of my vertex. Does this graph open up or down? Well, in front of the parentheses, there's no negative sign, so it's positive, so this one opens up. For the next one, x minus 4, the quantity squared, plus 8. What value for x makes that parenthesis equal to 0? Well, a positive 4 will make that parenthesis equal to 0. So that's the x value of my vertex. The y value of the vertex is whatever's on the outside, an 8. It's a positive in front, so this graph is going to open up. This graph, y equals negative quantity x minus 4 squared plus 8, has the same vertex, 4, 8, but it has a negative in front of the parenthesis, So this graph is going to open down. This next one can be a little bit tricky. This x squared we can think of as x plus 0, the quantity squared, and then the minus 7. So the x value of the vertex is a 0. The y value of the vertex is whatever's on the outside. It's a 7. Does this graph open up or down? It's positive in front, so this graph opens up. The vertex for this next function, what value makes that parenthesis 0? A -3. And then on the outside of the parenthesis is a -5. That's going to move it down 5 units on the y value. So my y value of the vertex is -5. Does this one open up or down? Well, it's a fraction in front, so it's going to be wider, but it's still positive, so it's going to open up. My next function, what value for x, what number can I put in for x to make that entire parenthesis 0? And I could put a -100 in there. -100 plus 100 makes that whole thing 0. And then the y value of the vertex is 50. Does this graph open up or down? Well, it has a negative in the front, so this graph opens downward. Next one. To find the coordinates of the vertex, really think about what we're doing is we're taking whatever this m value is, whatever this number is, and we're putting the opposite and making that my x value of the vertex. And then the y value of the vertex, we're taking whatever this n value was, and that is becoming the y value of the vertex. So there's my vertex for this one. Now, does it open up or down? It really depends. If that number in front is positive or greater than 0, it's going to open up. If that value in front of the parenthesis, that a value, is negative or less than 0, it's going to open downward. Now, we can use graphing technology, use decimals, check your predictions, see if you were correct for each one of these. I'm pretty confident that we were, but you could check them out. And when you're done, feel free to stay on your OneNote, and you can go ahead and complete the practice.